farm is in Gloucestershire, in the Severn and Vale. We've got about 950 acres here. A mixture of arable and permanent pasture, with some of them floodplain meadows. So when the floods were peak about 2 weeks ago, we probably had 350 acres underwater. Some of the meadows are in high-level scheme for species-rich or overwintering waders. And then other meadows are just permanent pasture that we just farm with kind of low inputs but aren't in any specific schemes. So the meadows that we're at here by Coombe Hill Nature Reserve, about 120 acres here. The majority goes underwater. We take a hay cut for these, so they'll have nothing done to them. They have no fertiliser, no sprays, nothing. And they take a hay cut in the end of June, beginning of July. Then we will move cattle down here and aftermath graze the cattle on the fields until the autumn, and then they come off in the autumn. Some of the fields on the banks we will graze in the spring because they've got ridge and furrow and other things, so we can't take hay cut. But it's quite important for the farm to have a balance between what we can do hay cut and aftermath graze, but we also have to have land that we can graze earlier in the year and take silage cuts. And the hay is very useful for feeding over winter for our young stock and our cows. They particularly like the hay from here. We've noticed that if we take hay from more kind of ryegrass, higher intensity fields compared to this hay, and we put 2 bales out for the cows, they'll eat all the hay from here before they'll touch the other hay. So on the floodplain land, I've tried different ways of grazing. One of the things I do when I make hay is I always leave a strip down the middle of every field, kind of a mower width. I kind of feel that if you're cutting a whole field for hay, you're just making a desert. So I leave a sanctuary. So when the cattle go in, they've got that bit to eat and anything that's around the edges and stuff. And then they'll stay probably from end of July till, I think we moved the last ones off in November this year. So other fields that are in the floodplain, I've got other regimes in. So I've got planted what I call a wetland herbal mix, which is grasses that will cope with being flooded and also have some herbs and stuff in there. And this year I did a trial mob grazing those. The cattle had basically an area for one day, and each day they were moved on. And that was really interesting, and I was really pleased, especially where the herbs were. They carried on growing even in that heat, and they were the only group of cattle that I had out that didn't need any supplementary feeding or anything. So I did also another trial on some other meadowland, but not species rich. I did one lot where I did rotational grazing. They were going in kind of normal covers, but every day they moved around. And then another lot, I just gave them a whole field. So they had similar growth rates between the two groups, but the ones on the rotational grazing used half the acreage that I used for the set stocking. While that was happening, we did some dung beetles and fetal egg count. And actually, because we're doing the long grass grazing, we never got to an amount of worms that we needed to worm the cattle. But we did notice when we had to fly treat them that hit the dung beetles. Not as bad as we thought, but it knocked it by about 50%, and then they came back again. I've just been offered an extension for a 10-year HLS, so I'm in year 11 now, and they've offered me 5 years, so it might be 16 years by the time I'm finished it. But before that, we were in countryside stewardship, and we had 2 goes at countryside stewardship, so that was 20 years. So that was before I was involved in the farm. I think it was FWAG that probably were in contact with my father, and my father was always very keen on the environment and wildlife, I suppose, more. Yeah, he likes his hedges big, he likes to see wildlife, and so that's why I assume he put it in as a... It pays. It means that we can farm them quite extensively, and they pay for themselves. I think if you didn't have the HLS, you'd think maybe I need to get more out of these fields. We don't put anything into them, so we haven't got a cost of inputs, but you've got your capital cost that you bought the land, and it needs to do something. If I only had these fields, then I think I'd find it hard. But because I've got the young stock from the dairy that I prefer to grow extensively, so they just grass fed, and I don't have them in sheds until I'm finishing them, it works well for me doing it that way. And the hay works well. I like the hay going back into the cows as well. So I think if I didn't have a place for the hay to go, and I didn't have any cattle to graze it, it would be hard. But it works in the context of the whole farm. Yeah, advice from people like FWAG has been very important, but then also kind of finding your own way. So there's advice there, and then you look at what other people do, and then you work out what fits your context. I think context is so important because every farm is different, and what works for me, having these meadows, might not work for my neighbour who hasn't got the other land that's not flooded, and so they need to do it in a different way. I probably have advice from different directions from different people. But things like, I think the first countryside stewardship, and I think this HLS FWAG advisor came and helped us, set it up. I'm in Severn and Vale Guardians, which we've been a part of for a few years. And then I'm also part of a dairy discussion group, then also kind of wider things like the regenerative pilot group, things like that. So kind of take lots of different advice and different ways of looking at it from different people. Just having that support that you know that you're doing the right thing. It isn't until a couple of years ago that people suddenly started telling me, "Oh, you've got really nice meadows there," and it's like, "Oh, it's quite nice to have that positive feedback and to know that you're doing something good." Most of the farm is quite heavy clay, high magnesium and high potassium. I've always done soil tests, but I've always done them more than just your magnesium, potassium, phosphate. I will always do calcium because calcium magnesium balance is quite important, I think, and I always do organic matter. Until a couple of years ago, I hadn't tested any of these fields at all down here because I thought we're not allowed to put anything on them, we're not going to do anything. But I was doing a suite of tests and I thought I'll just test them. And I was pleasantly surprised. Like one field had 23% organic matter and the others like 17, 18. Low phosphate, which I was expecting because you don't put anything on. They're reasonably high magnesium, and most of the farm is like pH 7.5, 7.8. These were a bit more towards the neutral range. These fields need to be farmed for their wildlife value. If we did not take hay cuts and graze them, they would very quickly revert to scrub and trees, and that wouldn't be suitable habitat for the breeding waders and the overwintering birds. And also you'd lose all those flowers and other botanical species, dragonflies, butterflies, everything else that's down here. So to keep them with their value that they have, they need to have hay cut. One field, when they were doing botanical survey, they heard lots of quail, more than one in that, so we left that field and we didn't cut it till September to leave them in peace. When there's water filling the meadows, a lot of the birds that are in the nature reserve next door that's got too much water come over, so we get a lot of different wetland birds. And when the cattle were grazing this autumn, there were clouds of yellow wagtail following them around, which was lovely. Lungworm is a worry on these kind of pastures, but all of them are vaccinated with a vaccine called HusVac before they come out, so I'm hoping that they don't need any worming. The timings, so you have beautiful weather ready to make hay in kind of middle of June, but you're not allowed to because of the requirements for the scheme, and then you're allowed to cut it, and then you get really bad weather, so that's sometimes a bit tricky. The other thing that we've noticed is that if we cut too late, we get more weeds coming, so the reed canary grass kind of likes the later cut. And there's quite a number of footpaths that come across the fields, which I love these fields and I'm happy to share them with people, but it's just people's attitudes. They think that it's a place for their dogs to run free, and when you say, I'm trying to encourage breeding curlews here, please don't let your dogs free, they give you abuse. We're doing things like we did ponds and pond restoration this year and some scrapes, so kind of improving those. And things like we go around kind of regularly and pollard the willows. Some of the hedges are getting really big now. On the whole farm, I want to have a rotation of coppicing hedges. And I've been using the the wood chip from when I've been doing the pollarding to add with muck, and the idea is to make that into compost with the slurry from the dairy. I want to plant some arable land that floods with the herbal wetland mix that I've had put in another bit of arable land, because that didn't require any fertiliser. It coped with being flooded, and I took one field I took 3 cuts of silage off last year without doing anything to it, whereas other things weren't growing and it grew. So I'd like to different bits of the floodplain managed in different ways. Some more nature friendly, the HLS, some more intensive but on a regenerative side. So I've got lots of ideas for the whole farm, but the meadows, I think they're good how they are. And I haven't been asked whether I want to kind of restore some of the more intensively farmed meadows to make them species rich, but I think if you take everything as species rich, it changes the balance of the farm, and I think you can't have all. It's got to have that balance between the different ways each are farmed. I'm trying to improve the grazing, reduce fertiliser use. I'm planning to put no bagged fertiliser on the whole farm this next year, and trying to do direct drilling and all sorts of other regenerative things. But the meadows, they're good how they are. I'm pleased with them. They produce, people want to come and take brush harvested seed and green hay from them to make other fields good. So I'm happy that the meadows stay how they are, really.